Hello and welcome to episode number 143 of the Board Game Barrage podcast, a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends even when you're losing. I am Kellen the Red Tank, and I am joined, as always, by Mark and Neelan.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
You may have missed me hosting an episode. There was an abhorrent episode that will not be named, 139, where I was absent. I have been very busy at work, but I am here to lead us through a good episode. And good has like a trademark on it, so that's good TM for the trademark symbol. The little TM, not the big one.
No.
I know how to use that, on the keyboard. Sometimes I just Google it, though, and I have to just control copy and control paste because I don't know the codes. Today, on episode number 143 of the Board Game Today, on
it was
episode number...
Scottish there.
Yeah, I'm not a wizard, mate.
Oh, wow. Richard, is that you? Who got caller?
That's what I'm saying. I'm Richard now. On episode 143 of the Board Game Barrage podcast, we are going to be covering pacing in board games. So that is occasionally referred to as the arc of the game. Think about it like pacing in films. What does a game feel like at the beginning, middle, and end, and what should it feel like? And what are the hallmarks of great pacing in board games? And what are some pacing problems that we see in modern board game designs? But before we talk about pacing, before we get to that climax in the third act, we will start, as always, with the games that we have been playing. Mark is going to take us through the modern classic Bus. I am going to follow that up with a new version of the game Quick and Easy. And we will end with a discussion of Tekhenu, led by Neelan. I'm sure I said that right. Tekhenu. This will continue in the tradition of Spakoof, in which we don't pronounce the game right. All right, Mark, why don't you tell us about Bus?
I'd love to. In fact, I'll start this off by thanking our patrons for selecting Bus. We had a poll, a patrons-only poll, and they could select a game that we would be forced to play. Any game was on the table.
Forced to buy and play.
Forced to buy and play. That's right.
Hard for Mark.
That's right. Yeah, I'm so used to trading. I had like a reflexive negative feeling when it came to buying a game. But anyway, so they could have selected any game. They selected Bus, and I'm very thankful for them for doing that because this is a game that I've been wanting to play for years now. It was a Grail game at one point. It was a game that was incredibly hard to find, as most Splendor games are, or many Splendor games are, I guess. Some are back in circulation, but many Splendor games are tough to find. Splendor is a small company, for those not aware, in the Netherlands, run by two guys, basically in their free time in their garages on weekends and nights off, and they produce some of the most groundbreaking games in the industry, including Bus, which is potentially, depending on who you ask, the first worker placement game. Bus was made back in 1999, and a lot of people consider it the very first worker placement game. And I'll say that it may be
1999?
Yeah.
Roll call. How old were we all?
20.
13.
10.
You were 10?
Yeah, what are you talking about? Might even have been 9, depending on what part of the year, bro.
You were probably 10. Anyhow. So, oh God, we did it last week. Let's not recycle the bit. Anyhow, Bus. What is Bus? Bus is a game about buses. Each person is in charge of their own bus line, and they are trying to ferry the most passengers around this city. The scoring is extremely simple. You score a point for every passenger you get to their destination, and that is the only source of points. The board has a scoring tracker that goes up to 20. I felt like when we were sitting down to play it, I was like, oh, we're going to get to the high end. Like, why would they only do 20? Turns out 20 is a good number to have as your max point range, because we got halfway there, and that was as far as we went. Anyway.
Yeah, we all got very close to halfway to 20 points.
Some closer than others.
Correctly.
Like, specifically the person speaking now, closer to others, specifically the person who just spoke. But
the aforementioned person.
The four-voiced South African in the room. Anyhow, the way Bus works is, if you're familiar with dominant species, the way the worker placement works will be very familiar to you. Most of the board is taken up with a map, which has a city with interconnected streets. It's sort of not a grid. It's like sort of an old-fashioned European city with streets going every which way. And at the intersections of streets, there are places to place buildings. There can be 1 or 2 buildings depending on the intersection. And then beside this map is a worker placement section. The worker placement section is laid out in rows. So there's a section on top where you can expand your bus line. The second section is increasing your number of buses. The third section is passengers, then buildings, then the time control worker placement spot, then what's called the vroom spot where you actually can ferry passengers along, and then a starting player spot. So there are a number of spots where you can place your workers, and they're all laid out row atop of row atop of row atop of row. And the worker placement is actually a very interesting part of this game because you start out with 20 workers. That is your entire pool. And every round, you must play at least 2. You can pass after you've played the first 2, but you can play as many as you want. But the thing is, at the end of the round, when all the workers have been activated, all the workers you've placed go out of the game. So you have a maximum of 20 workers to play, and you will never get any more back. None of them stay on the board. Once you place a worker, it is gone, and that is 1 from your 20 done. Another interesting thing is that some of the spots, for example, the spot that activates first, and again, these worker placement spots activate from top to bottom, but all spots activate from left to right. But some spots, you place workers from right to left. The reason that is interesting is that, for example, the very first spot is line expansion, where you can expand your bus route. And the number of streets you can expand your bus route is based on what's called, and we were all joking about this, the maximum bus value, which is
MBV for short.
MBV, that's right. Whoever has the most buses defines the MBV. So if Kellen had 3 buses in his system and Neil and I had 2, the MBV for everybody would be 3 in that example. And that MBV is the basis for a lot of how powerful the actions are. So if Kellen has 3 buses and the MBV is 3, when you place out your workers in the, for example, line expansion spot, the first person will place their worker at the very far right end and therefore activate last. But they will be able to extend their bus line by 3 streets because the MBV is 3. So say I place that very first spot, I get to extend my line by 3, but I go last. If Kellen places his worker next, which is the farthest rightmost spot that's available, he would now get 1 less street. So he is going to extend his bus by 2, but go before me. And then if Neelan goes before Kellen, Neelan would extend his line by 1 street, but go first. Kellen, who's next, would extend his by 2 and go second. And I, who placed first, get the most, but I activate last. So that's an interesting part of the game and an interesting consideration to make in some of the spots.
Some spots activate in first in, last out.
Right, exactly.
And some spots activated first in, first out.
That's right, exactly. Yes, what Kellen said, exactly. So it's interesting to think about, do I want to get the most powerful action but potentially go last, or do I not care about having a powerful action but want to make sure I place that 1 line somewhere?
I think what makes Bus so interesting is that the area control board that you're building is being built in real time alongside very, very tight worker placement that Mark is describing. So you only have 2 bus lines out on the board at the beginning of the game, and there are barely any buildings out. And so you're making the choice. You're not going to get to go first in all the things you want to get to go first in. So either you are going to get to place buildings and put out a couple of buildings on the board, or you're going to increase the amount of passengers you can deliver, or you're going to get to deliver passengers first, or you're going to get to go first in putting out routes onto the board. You are never going to get to do all of those things first. And so every round is quite literally a, would I care more about this or would I care more about that? But that is confounded by what Mark mentioned, which is the fact that you can actually place as many workers as you want to. It isn't a set, okay, everyone has 3 workers this round. It's minimum 2, maximum, you could play all of them if you were a dummy.
And if you played all of them, you would just be out. You would have no more workers for the rest of the game. So that's an interesting consideration to make when it comes to how you want to pace yourself in terms of, do you want to make a big splashy start early or do you want to conserve for later in the game?
Time travel, Mark. Tell them about the time travel.
That's the key. So there's only 7 types of spots in the entire game. And that's one of the charms of this game is it's really simple to teach because there's not really much to consider in terms of the number of placements. There's a lot to consider in terms of like planning and stuff, but it's not a very complicated, I think, game. But just to run through the worker placement spots, there's line expansion where you expand your bus route. There's buses where you add more buses to your fleet, and the reason that's important is the aforementioned maximum bus value, which affects everybody's consideration when it comes to how powerful actions are, but also the number of buses you have indicates how many passengers you can ferry per worker you place in the vroom spot, and the vroom spot is where you move people along. So for example, if you place a worker in the vroom spot and your bus fleet is 3, you can move 3 passengers and get 3 points. The next spot is passengers, where you can allot passengers to one of 2 depots. The next one is buildings, where you can select the type of buildings that you place on the board. There are 3 types of buildings. So there are homes where people want to be during the day. There are workplaces where people want to be in the evening, and there are bars where people want to go at night. And then after the bars, they want to go back home. So that's the cycle of what people want to go: home, work, bars. And so in one round, people may want to go home, and then the next round, they'll want to go to work. Except the next spot is the time continuum spot. And this is where things get interesting. So there is an explanation of why this exists in the game. It's something about like people have figured out how to affect time, but there are these time stones and
bus drivers.
Yeah, bus drivers, right. Heads of these bus lines. So the time continuum, when you place a worker there, there's only one spot, but if you place a worker there, you can elect to stop time. You do that by taking a time stone. The time stone is a -1 point at the end of the game. And again, our winning score was 10. So you can imagine that taking a time stone is a big hit potentially. But what it does, it stops time. So instead of people wanting to go home last turn and now want to go to work, they want to stay at home. And the reason that's interesting is because when it comes to ferrying people around, if they are sitting on a spot where they're already satisfied, like if somebody is at an intersection where a home is, instead of taking your bus line, he'll just go home. Why would he pay for your bus fare? It doesn't make any sense, right? So that's thematically correct, like everything is in this game. So that's a powerful thing to consider because there's not many opportunities to move people along. And if you elect to stop time, many of the passengers that otherwise could have been ferried around are going to elect to just stay where they are because they're already are at home. Most of them will already be at some place where they're satisfied. So in a game where points are super hard to come by, it's a very big move to say, you know what, I'm actually going to stop time and have the potential number of points scored go from like 3 points a player potentially to like a situation where people are scrounging around for 1 or 2 points.
And it creates like this like incredible like tension over that work, all of the worker placement really, because you're doing all of this like meticulous planning and there is this thought in the back of your head of like, wait, what if someone stops time after I've done all of this? Like, should I place the piece there to make sure that someone doesn't? It's almost just like this like ominous cloud hanging over that entire phase. Is someone going to stop time or not?
And the thing is, it's such a costly thing. It's even costly to bluff that you're going to stop time, because if you put your worker there and you decide you're just bluffing, you've just spent a worker for literally nothing. Mm-hmm. I mean, for the right to protect that spot, but for no other gain. And that's pretty costly. And if you elect to do the time stop action, you're losing a point. And again, 10 points is probably a pretty decent score in this game. So that's a big hit. Finally, the other 2 worker spots are the vroom spot, the comically named vroom spot, which is just ferrying passengers around if you're able to. And then finally, the starting player spot, where the first person to go there claims starting player for the next round, which is also a very powerful action, as you can imagine, because there are so few different types of actions and they're so influential. So that is Bus. I think it would take me less time to explain the rules than I have done this overview. I think it's a pretty concise game in terms of number of rules. Thank you very much. Very kind of you. What did you guys think of Bus?
Bus is awesome. I think it's a classic for a reason. The tightness of the action selection or worker placement, I suppose, though they aren't meeples, they're little cylinders. They don't look like workers, so that wasn't very thematic for me. Felt a lot like Dominant Species, like you mentioned, where you're sort of programming it out. It's like, well, if Christina gets passengers, that's probably going to help me, so maybe I can go vroom before everybody else. Oh, but my MBV isn't high enough, and so that sort of meticulous planning is fun. You combine that with area control, where being the first on a route is good, but there are ways for other people to come onto your route. Can be incredibly frustrating. You build this like nice route, and then you're like, hey, wait a minute, like Christina's about to intersect with me, and then she's going to steal the buildings that I built and the passengers that I recruited. It is a game where if you have the potential to get points, you should lock that in. Like, lock those points in, because you may not get that opportunity again.
Yeah.
I was not pleasantly surprised. I knew Bus was going to be good. I was surprised at how concise everything was and felt and fit together. And we got into it, and it just sort of revealed different layers of what was possible in Bus. That was my opening take on Bus.
Bus, in some ways, exemplifies a lot of the feel that I get from other Splotter games, which is that, especially in the case of Bus, I actually think this is less true of Food Chain, Magnate, and Great Zimbabwe, which are the other two that I played. But in Bus, you have a very simple rule set, but what you have is this very strong disconnect between your input and the result you're going to get out. There are like several layers of behavior between that point. And what I mean by that is you have this best intention of like putting all these workers out and things that you're like, okay, I'm going to put buildings here, I'm going to put passengers here, and by the time it gets to the room phase, it's going to be perfect. This guy's going to go there, this guy's going to go there, this guy's going to go there. But their games tend to play almost like simulations in a little bit of a way, where it's a little bit unpredictable. By the time you actually get to the execution of the system, everything just goes awry. Whether that's because of other people like having outplayed you or having anticipated stuff in a way that's one step ahead of you, or just having a better grasp of the system, by the time you get to that point where you've put in workers and you're supposed to be getting points, and then you just don't, which frequently happened to me. The thing we glossed over a little bit is I ended that game with 1 point. One passenger
It was
delivered.
Elon. The amount of times that we were like halfway through executing the worker placement and you like sighed really loudly or put the heads in your head.
I would realize well before we got to the room part that I'm like, I messed this up. I know what's going to, and I can see it because like I can work through all of the steps, but I can never do it at the requisite point where I'm actually placing the worker. So it would always get to that point where, and I would be like, yeah, I'm not delivering anyone. And this work is not delivering anyone either. It's a byproduct of their hyper-competitive games. Like, Kellen and I, our lines were basically choking each other, and Kellen won that fight at almost every opportunity. But it's such an interesting thing that other games don't do. Like, we'll come back to this when I'm going to be talking about Tekhenu, where you're taking an action and you're getting points. That feedback is instant. That doesn't happen in Splendor games. You take an action and then you hope that's going to translate into points like a couple of steps down the line. And that messes with my brain in ways that I can't tell you. So a frustrating game of Bus for me, but one I would definitely want to revisit for sure.
I really, really enjoyed it. It's a game that has gained in my estimation since we played it. Again, granted, that's 24 hours, but like, thinking about it, it's just gotten me more and more excited to play it again. One thing I want to say is like with a game like this that's like a Grail game, I always feel some level of intimidation, especially with like a Splotter game, because these are like known for being weird and economic.
Actually, this is made by Capstone Games.
Actually, it's made by Splotter, and Capstone is reprinting
it. Did you see the box that we played with? You idiot.
I'm looking at the box right now. So getting back to the Grail thing, like there's a level of intimidation just thinking about
getting back to the game.
Getting back to actually the point of this episode. It was so cool to find out that it's such a concise, as Kellen said, simple rule set. I just love that. Like this game that has this mythical quality. I just had this image in my mind of it being very complicated and being like, again, like the 18XX thing when I first entered it, thinking it was like difficult for me to like enter into, but it's just such a streamlined game. I absolutely loved it. Even what Neelan, I don't think Neelan was saying it in a pejorative way, but the way that the actions worked and the way that your plans, you can see them crumble as you go down the worker placement spots. I just love that. I absolutely love that. And spoiler for later on, but I think my estimation of Bus rose as we were playing Tekhenu. In contrast, and we'll get into more of that later, and I think that was perhaps just me, but like the contrast between the two games brought it into stark relief.
I want to say that this Bus is heavy, but it doesn't have too many rules, so it's the right kind of heavy Bus.
Yeah.
I will say that the system by which you can use all of your workers whenever you want is not a positive thing for me. I get why it's fun in the abstract to be like, you can do whatever you want, good sir, like it's your bus route. But what it does do is it means that every turn you have to evaluate the potential to score points in this turn and the potential for you to score points on every subsequent turn for the rest of the game. And now I do think that that's a problem particularly on early plays of the game where you don't know whether it's worth ever investing workers at the beginning. But with that said, I do enjoy some of the more Euro-like efficiency of, okay, I have 3 workers, and how do I maximize the points for this round? And there's satisfaction there. The satisfaction in Bus is a little bit more open-ended because I may have spent 5 workers to score 3 points, and was that the right thing? And then when you get to the end of the game, it does make a huge difference who has workers left going into those last few rounds of Bus. So for me, I understand why that's cool and why it's fun. It feels like one of those Splotter edges that's probably not for me because I'm not going to play Bus hundreds of times. The Bus is too heavy for me, as it were, but a very good game.
I also have to say before we close out that Capstone's version of this looks beautiful.
Who made the one that we played?
Capstone's version.
Oh, did they publish it?
They did publish it.
I thought we said, but what if we
Who
were
created it?
Splotter? What
From whose mind did it spring?
It splotted out?
It's splotted out. It's splotted out of a couple of guys from the Netherlands.
I choose Capstone.
Have you seen the original board?
I am looking at it now. It's quite a thing.
It's crazy.
I don't think I hate it, which is actually what I was expecting, but it's definitely abstract and weird.
I think wacky is
Wacky is good. Wacky is a good word for that. But yeah, no, Capstones looks like they've got a bus map aesthetic. Like it looks just clean and graphically stable compared to
a little food for thought for Capstone Games, who will probably listen to this because they listen to this podcast. Why not Magic School Bus? Why did you do time travel when it's already built in? I would have bought that.
We did buy it.
No. Don't say that.
So that is Bus by Splotter, published by Capstone Games.
And how do you spell that for people who want to search it?
That is B-U-S.
Oh, really?
By Splotter, reprinted by Capstone Games, but originally by Splotter. Splotter.
All right. So another game that we got to play at Board Game Night with our COVID masks on, stay safe, everyone, was a game from Pandasaurus Games, the game Quick and Easy. This is a review copy of the game. We just want to say that up front. The game is one of my favorite games. I hate talking about the game because it's called the game. This is one of the only cooperative games that I like, and the game Quick and Easy is a smaller, simpler variation on the game. So what you do in the game Quick and Easy is there are 5 sets of 10 cards in 5 different colors, numbered 1 through 10, and everyone has 2 cards in their hand. And you are playing on 2 piles of cards, 1 pile going from 1 to 10, and 1 pile going from 10 to 1. And you have to play cards sort of sequentially in ascending or descending order. Everyone cannot say what cards they have specifically in their hand, but they can say, no, I want to play on that pile. Please leave it for me. And you can play 1 or 2 cards on your turn. And if you cannot play a card on your turn, everyone loses the game. Or in this case, everyone loses the game, Quick and Easy. The twist, the rub here, is that you are always allowed to play the same color on top of another color. So if you get into a tight spot, if the 10 to 1 pile, has a 2 on it, meaning the next person can only play a 1 there, oh, maybe they have an 8 in the same color, and they sort of soft reset that pile to help everyone else out. So this would be trivial if everyone could see everyone's cards, but what makes the game Quick and Easy, what makes the game a game, what makes the game good is the fact that you can't communicate or that there is limited communication. So this is basically designed in the game, not the game Quick and Easy. There are 4 piles, if I'm not mistaken, and the range of cards goes from 1 to 100 as opposed to 1 to 10 repeated 5 times. So this is a simplification of the system, and I think this is great.
Yes, I also really enjoyed it. It is quick and easy. It's a great version of this that you would feel more comfortable playing with non-gaming friends and family. I think the game is simple enough to teach, and I've had success with that with non-gamers, but Quick and Easy is even more so. My concern when I saw the game Quick and Easy was that it was going to be dumbed down or like
too quick,
too easy.
Or too easy.
Right.
That's the sequel.
That's right. But it was not. It was super fun. We ran it 3 times in a row, and I would have been happy to play it a couple more times.
Yeah, I think it's hard to improve on the original for me. And I think that what everyone has already said is that this takes what is, maybe a 20 to 30 minute game and condenses it down to 5 to 10 minutes while making the highs a lot more frequent. Because you only have 2 piles, it feels like you're getting into trouble more often. And it feels like you have to more frequently say, no, don't touch that pile because it's the only one I can play on. The game gives you a little bit more room to breathe more frequently and more often. And you go out quicker in this because by virtue of the fact that you're running into trouble more, sometimes your luck doesn't pay off and then you're just out and you reset and you start over. Quick and easy. Like, that's the promise of the title, and I think it's actually absolutely true. In a way that it's almost hard to replicate the same system but still reduce it as much. But I think they've actually succeeded here in a way that's quite impressive.
A couple things. The game Quick and Easy has a professional variant in the rulebook, which seems odd for a lighter, breezier version of another game. So we had trouble figuring out whether we should play the professional version or play the regular version, and I really don't like it when there are multiple ways to play the same game. I would have preferred just one way to play the game, Quick and Easy. And secondly, Christina thought that the art was kind of some kind of joke, or that something had gone wrong. The version of the game that we have is by Kwanchai Morier, who has just amazing artwork, maybe one of my favorite sets of artwork in any game in this alt version of the game. The game Quick and Easy reverts to this sort of skull and crossbones, cartoony art style that is crying, in my opinion, for a retheme. I won't say what kind of retheme. But a very good game, and one that, we handed off to Neelan, who will be seeing some normies more sooner than the rest of us to kind of see how it goes, which is complete casuals, filthy casuals. But I think it's going to be quick. I think it's going to be easy, and I think they're going to love it.
Yeah, and I think of where I'm interested to make that comparison, especially because I just, as by coincidence, I played the game with them for the first time a couple of weeks ago, so we'll have that very close proximity point of reference from their perspective. So yeah, excited to try that.
But honestly, I actually expect to end up having both of these in my collection when we're done at the end of the day, which is going to be hard to wrap my head around or justify to myself. But I'm very good at justifying things to myself.
And they're both such small packages. They're the size of a deck of cards, or 2 decks of cards, I guess.
What was the joke there?
I'm just informing the listeners. I'm here for the information.
Not everything is a bit, Callan.
Yeah, I know. Can we be serious for once?
You accuse me? Me of no substance?
You're all sizzle, no steak.
Have you, excuse me, sir? Have you looked at LinkedIn in the last
That's true.
48 business hours?
What title did you give yourself? CFO, CEO?
Founder,
and CEO.
and host. I didn't know what the difference between a host and a co-host. Because we're all hosts, or we all share it. If there's only one host, are they the host? And then everyone else is a co-host?
I think we're all hosts.
Yeah, I feel like I've always referred to us as collectively the co-hosts, because host does imply a more primary role, but I might maybe wrong about that. I guess we're all the hosts. Why not?
Yeah.
So,
you're hosts
Neelan,
for this evening. Yeah, sure.
I'm just a little confused then why, when I stumbled upon your LinkedIn, it also lists you as host.
Because I wasn't going to put myself as co-host when you had already put yourself as host.
About? What do you mean?
That's not how this works. We're either all
What
co-hosts.
do you mean that's how this works?
Hosts.
No, we're all hosts.
Well,
You have to represent yourself powerfully.
Exactly.
We're all hosts.
I don't agree. And Mark, who has never seen the inside of a business in his life,
I've seen the inside of a gym, though.
has no LinkedIn.
That's right. I fight the power.
Yes. Okay, let us move on. Mark? No?
Yes, I've already talked, but I can talk again if you want.
Well, it's because you're people.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
I almost feel
Neelan-
bad that I'm the one talking
True.
about the plight of the Egyptian people in Tekhenu.
I'll allow it.
Okay, thank you.
Just one
thank
time.
you. Thank you. So Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun is the full title of this game. Tekhenu is apparently just the ancient Egyptian word for those obelisks. So this is the latest in what I've seen some people refer to as Tuskini's T series of games. So this is Tzolk'in, Teotihuacan, Tekhenu, and they're all these elaborate, heavy Euro games that are in reference to ancient civilizations and ancient cities. What is interesting about this is that Tekhenu has been involved in all three of them, whereas he was paired with one of the other Italian designers for Tzolk'in. I believe he designed Teotihuacan on his own. And this time he's paired with David Turczi. And the end result is a game that very much feels like in that vein. It has a lot of similarities to Teotihuacan, in that I always feel like the premise of these games is taking a much-loved mechanic. In the case of Tzolk'in, that's worker placement. In the case of Teotihuacan, it's sort of this rondel worker movement. In the case of Tekhenu, it is dice drafting. They add a little mechanical twist that ups the complexity, the idea of time advancing in Tzolk'in, the idea of your workers aging over time in Teotihuacan. And in the case of Tekhenu, you have the obelisk in the center of your dice drafting pool. The sun moves around it and it changes the purity of the dice in a way that affects your ability to draft them. When the sun is in certain positions, you cannot take dice from those sections of the pool. When the sun is in some positions, some of those dice are pure. When the sun is in certain positions, some of those dice are tainted. What does that all mean? Well, as in most dice drafting games, the dice are placed into pools that correspond to specific actions. When you pull a die from that pool, you're either going to take the action where that die originated from, and we'll come back to this in a little bit, or you're just going to collect some resources. But whether that die is pure or tainted, it goes onto either side of your player mat on these scales. So over the course of 1/4 of the game, you're collecting 4 dice, putting them on either side of your scales, and at the end of that phase, you're going to be judged in what's called the Ma'at phase. This is the goddess of judgment, and she's going to make sure that you've been taking an equal quantity of both pure and tainted dice. And that's going to determine your turn order going into the next quarter of the game, which, if you're familiar with dice drafting, is usually a very powerful thing. Getting access to the best dice in the best locations can be very, very powerful. So if you're taking one of the primary actions, those are divided into like these 6 other gods of Egypt, which are all sectioned off into different areas of this massive board. You could have the temple building section where you're placing pillars in this sort of spatial puzzle type thing to score points. You could have the production section where you're placing buildings to increase your potential production. There is a happiness track which determines your access to cards. There is an action purely for pulling cards, which are either going to be passive benefits, once-off little bonuses, or end-of-game scoring. And then finally, there's also a way to place statues around the pools of actions themselves, which will allow you to get little passive trickles of benefits when other people take those actions. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of nuance to all of these things. I'm very much simplifying all of this because otherwise we would be here for an hour. But suffice it to say that there is a lot going on in this game, and the way that it twists the knob on complexity on the concept of dice drafting is almost, at first blush, a little bit much, because every 2 rounds, the sun moves, you rotate this little dial in the middle, and all of the dice shift their positions from forbidden to pure to tainted, and you add more dice into the system. And then every half of the game, there's a scoring phase. There were these 4 judgment phases. I made and printed out a play guide just to show all the 16 rounds of this game and what happens after the 2nd round and the 4th round and the 8th round. It's a lot. I think that is a game that when I came out of the rules side of it, I was very worried as to how I would receive it and how Mark and Kellen would. But my enjoyment of it definitely increased over the time of playing it. Like, that first dive into it at the beginning was this sort of, I don't really get how these systems link together, and then you start to get a feel for that as you progress over the course of the game, in a way that by the end of it, I was feeling quite excited about moves I was pulling off. And then Mark did some stupid and won the game because he flipped over a card that was worth 50 points or something dumb like that, which is a very Mark thing to do. But
got that right.
What did you guys think of Tekhenu?
I was a little nervous at first because I had these like recollection of Trismegistus in my mind, and I think it does share some DNA with that game where there's like, it's dice drafting like Trismegistus, and there's a lot of interconnected parts. And there's also a thing that carries over between the 2 games is there's a little bit of opacity in the way that things are labeled. The board is actually fairly clear for as much as is going on the board. It's sectioned off pretty well, but there's a lot of symbols. There's a lot of like, you know, the god actions being related to certain things where it was sort of hard to keep in mind what god was connected to what and what that meant. And there were so many symbols that it was somewhat hard to like internalize, which is, for me at least, a big problem with Trismegistus. But I was pleasantly surprised as we played it. I think it is constructed well. I think it's a solid game, but it was hurt to me for two reasons. One, the way I ended up playing, and this is not really the fault of the game, but I was dealt a card in the setup, which was sort of a goal card, and it encouraged me to amass a certain resource, the scribes, which are very useful for adjusting dice and letting you do actions that normally you're unable to do. But for me, each one of them was worth a decent number of points. So I, from the very beginning, was sort of set on a path to like just amass these things, and it ended up being the reason why I won. I think I played a worse overall game than the other two guys, but my strategy was just like, get these points, get these points, get these points. So early on, I had a very narrow strategy, and I think maybe it didn't allow me to feel all the parts of the game and like experience all the different mechanisms. But also, and I alluded to this in the bus explanation, just the complexity of the rules, which I'm fine with them in general, but the concision of the bus rules versus the number of rules and pieces and dice and all these things with Tekhenu was like a really big contrast. You know, I was enjoying Tekhenu, but I had enjoyed bus, and the low rules overhead, the low pieces overhead for bus was just like strong in my mind, and it was just like, wow, this is a much different game. You know, they're both good, but like the cleanliness of bus and the trim nature of it was just like hurting my appreciation for Tekhenu at the time. I think it's fine, but it's a hard game for me to find myself eager to play again, especially with people who are not familiar with it, because then there's the whole rules explanation that you have to go through, and that's tough.
As you were describing the game, I was, well, not the game, but Tekhenu. I was very convinced that I was going to have a rant inserted right here in the episode. I was pleasantly surprised with where we netted out in terms of my enjoyment of the game. And that isn't to say that I liked it. I arrived at a position where it was sort of like if Neelan said, Kellen, this is my favorite game. You know, I'd like to play it once a fortnight. Will you be my friend? I would begrudgingly play Tekhenu once a fortnight. It has that Euro thing where it's about scoring points on this turn, a very sort of Feldian point salad nature to it. It didn't feel particularly combo-licious, which is something that I like. And the ability to combo things was all built into this card system, which could only be accessed from one section of the board that you couldn't always get access to based on what dice were available. The dice system, the tainted, pure, and no-go dice system, I think is interesting, but felt like much ado about nothing. In a game where 100 points is a good score, the maximum that tainted and pure dice system could even affect you would be if you scored -3, what would that be, 4 times? For a total of -12. And yet so much of the game was, okay, I have a pure die, so I have 7 over here, so I need a good action, but I need it to balance my scales. There was so much thought going into the micro decision of trying to balance your scales when it didn't amount to much of the point scoring potential of the game. So it felt like too much thinking for not enough payoff in that system. It also suffers from the Euro problem of feeling like it has 6 different mini games happening on different parts of the board. And it's like, okay, so there's area control over here, and I'm doing a little puzzle over in that corner, you know, and then in this corner I've got a track, and in this corner is the card track, and each one of those overlaps with a different mini game. And it's okay, so that's population, but where is my happiness? Oh, that's up there, and that affects this track. It borderlined for me on Lacerda level, like interconnectedness. And at the end of the day, for me, if I'm dice drafting, you know, the review that I wrote for this on Board Game Geek is, you know, this game is twa for people who don't like fun or combos. It's super fiddly. The round structure is like 1, 2, twist, 1, 2, feed, twist, 1, 2, twist, 1, 2, twist and score and feed. You know, 1,
Those were also
2,
the steps to the dance we were doing as we were playing it.
And then you do that one more time. And so it's almost like there's no sense of exploration. You are racing from the first turn. With that said, the good things are it is tight. I did feel like we were jostling, you know, the area control in the bottom left corner. Mark and I were duking it out for those points. It felt like, oh no, there's only 3 good dice and I'm not going to get them. So there were parts of it that I really enjoyed. I know, one of our longtime friends of the podcast, the Game Table on Instagram, just loves this thing and has made like 5 posts about it in the last month. And that gives me pause, but I don't think it's ever going to be a love for me. And then confounded with Mark, having a card with a point value potential of unlimited when, the card that I got dealt at the beginning of the game had literally a limited point value of 18 max. It's so tough, man, because one of the mini games is also a similar thing to Glory to Rome, where it's like you can lay claim to every time someone does this action in the future, you will score off that. And that made me go, oh my God, I love that. Like I'm going to focus on that thing. And then it only pays off in these like small incremental little bits. It's like every time someone takes a card, now I get one more token. It just, nothing ever felt like it interlocked in a way that I had a turn that I went, oh my God, I just did amazing. Except, the last turn when Mark revealed his Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap card and won the game with 60 points.
And to Kellen's point, real quick to interject, Kellen had this thing where he was trying to draft off of other people's actions and was getting like one resource here, one resource here, one resource here. I was drafting off of just one specific action because the payoff for me for that was getting one of these tokens, which was 3 points. So like, whereas Kellen was getting 1 bread or 1 limestone or 1 whatever, 1 marble, I was getting 3 points every time somebody did that. So that was a big discrepancy in terms of the benefits we were getting from this drafting action.
And I'm not even saying that card is a problem.
Sure, no,
whereas
I am.
It allowed you to, it bypassed so many of the systems in the game that you
for sure.
maybe should have been participating in.
Sure.
I would just say, like, if you want tight dice drafting, you should play Trois because it's more painful and it's more interactive and it's much shorter.
I think you've actually hit on what is my chief complaint with it exactly there, Callan, is that I think that the very concept of the game, of taking a dice drafting game and sort of adding all these layers to it, all these little mini games, all these interconnected systems, is all well and good, but in my mind, you've lost some of the substance of dice drafting. And we'll come back to this in this episode, because I think it's a rife fit for this episode, of the difference between this and like Trois, right? Where the thinning of the dice in Trois is such a intricate part of the way that game is paced. In Tekhenu, it never felt like that so much. It kind of felt like there was an influx of dice and they never quite all going away. It just felt like there were not necessarily the abundance of dice, because certain sections of the board do empty at times, but it never felt like it had that, oh my gosh, I'm now down to like 3 more dice. Which of these is the best for me? You always felt like you had enough options that I felt like some of the essence of dice drafting was lost a little bit. It's the problem I frequently have with Lacerda's games, of this idea of complexity for complexity's sake. And I felt that even with Teotihuacan, and I think that it is more so in Tekhenu. Teotihuacan, I think that there is a lot of shared DNA between these two games in terms of like having big sections of the board that have very disparate, complex actions, and like the pyramid building of the one game becomes the temple building of this game, and so on. I think that if you like Teotihuacan, you're almost certainly going to like this. I'm quite comfortable saying that. I personally did not love Teotihuacan. I liked it, and by the same measure, I like this, at least on first blush. I want to play more of it, because I do think it is one of those games that's only going to improve the more you play it and get more familiar with its systems in a way that's not going to seem as fiddly. But I did not have a very strong initial high.
Sir, you complaining about his card, but are you remembering the card that you whizzle-wazzled into on the last
no, but
turn?
I was planning
that gave you a complete extra turn.
Totally. Yeah, but I was planning for that
with
card.
no
It was like, basically
cost?
I was like, well, this sort of card should exist, and we haven't seen it. So I'm going to wipe the slate, get a whole fresh set of cards, and there it was. Like, well, I planned for that. I may as well take it. And
I was in the shower, Neelan, thinking of you.
As you do.
And I thought,
Oh my gosh.
I thought of this card, and I realized it's like the most card you could have in a Euro game. It's like essentially like take an extra turn. So every other player skip your turn. Okay. So like it's a skip 2 players' turns card, and do whatever you want.
For free.
For free. I whizzle-wazzled and got 3 points, right? I got the card that got me the thing, and you got to just continue your strategy for an entire extra action after us.
That card, I think, is actually equally problematic in the ways that I kind of feel Mark is. But I actually feel like this is a big problem with the decree cards in general, which are these end-of-game scoring cards, which it does feel that by the time you're able to get them at the end of the game, some of them are worth a chunk of points and some are worth very few points. And that just felt a little bit weird to me.
And the way in which that they're, instead of doing a graduated deck system where there's like end of game scoring cards and beginning of game potential score, it does you can only have cards with this symbol, one of this symbol, one of that, and one of that. So they've just like divvied those up in their point potential and then been like, you can only have one of each of these things. And it's a messy way to like fix, quote unquote, the problem. But if you ask the designer on Board Game Geek, get good.
In summary, interesting game, interesting systems, one that I will definitely revisit and would easily recommend to people that have been a fan of this series. Not coming out of the gate swinging for me, but very intrigued by it. That is Tekhenu, Obelisk of the Sun by Board and Dice.
Before we move on to our featured topic, I just want to shout out our math trade, which if you hear this on the day that it's released, you still have today, which is Thursday the 8th, to submit games. But the guy who runs Apecorn let me know today that our math trade is the largest shipping math trade that Apecorn has ever done. And Neil and I were talking about this earlier, and we were checking the numbers, and this rivals the U.S. trades on OLWLG, which are the largest regular trades I'm aware of. So we have something like over 4,000 items listed right now, and the U.S. trades max out at around 5,000, a little over 5,000. So we're right on the doorstep. So this is amazing. So if you have ever been interested, and again, we're going to make this beginner friendly. So if you're interested in doing a math trade, this seems like a pretty good place to hop in because we've got a ton of games out there for you. So as always, you can go to boardgamebarrage.com/trade to join on in.
BGB is as big as BGG, confirmed.
That's right. Boom. Bingo. We're as big as the U.S.
Kill confirmed. All right, we are going to jump right into our featured topic today, which is on pacing in board games. Movies have a 3-act structure, and so do board games, perhaps, maybe. Here we go. Let us start with what we think about how pacing affects board games, how that feels at the beginning of the game, and how games should end. Who wants to go first and tell us how they feel about pacing in board games?
In general, for me, I like games that sort of build to a crescendo, that ramp up. And I think the type of game that lends itself to this the most are engine builders. I like that idea of like at first you're looking and you're producing one resource or you're producing one point, and by the end of the game you've got this monster engine where you're cranking out points. It's always a fun thing that it can happen in board games that I really enjoy.
I think that that's a great point about specifically engine builders because they give a sense of pace to a game even if you are bad at the game.
Right. You're
which
always
is
getting
to say,
better.
Yeah, you're always producing more. It's like, well, what am I going to do with 7 boxes of chocolates and a thing of roses that doesn't build, my next settlement in Catan, but I have those resources. And so an engine builder is a great way to build a sense of pace or to feel like what you're doing on a later turn is much stronger than what you've done at the beginning.
One of the ways that I like to think about this, because I think that the engine builder idea discussion does lend itself to this, but is this idea in music, and that's been like appropriated for other contexts, of like tension and release, of this idea that you're building up tension for this moment and then releasing it in a satisfying way. And video games trade in this idea that you have these lulls and big action high points. Movies capitalize on this. You have this slow build and then this big climactic moment and then like a release, and you repeat that cycle. So
Denouement.
Say that again?
Denouement.
What?
That's the term in a movie where like the things are like unwind at the end.
Ah, interesting.
Denouement.
There we go. I did not know that that's how you pronounce that word.
That's your French for the day, and you're going to get no more of it.
So I think that some of the best board games take this premise of like these big build up to anticipatory moments and then allowing you to deliver on them. And it's kind of the way that I like combo-y games where you are trying to like build, lay down your groundwork and then find a way to deliver on it. The thing I was trying to do 5 times in bus and failed to do every single time. That's the sort of pace I like in a game.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up here is a principle that I have applied to my daily life, which I call the soy sauce principle.
Can't wait.
So this was taught to me over 10 years ago. I lived with a Chinese man, and we had rice, always jasmine, rice, and soy sauce with 3 meals a day. Now you might ask, well, doesn't that get a little bland? Everything feels the same. And this is where you bring in the aforementioned soy sauce principle.
Soy
The
sauce
soy sauce
principle.
principle, yes. So me, in my infinite folly of youth, I would put on the soy sauce on my rice, and then I would stir the entire thing, thereby spreading out the soy sauce over all of the rice. Now, when I was 20, I was taught the soy sauce principle, which is to say that when you put on the soy sauce on your white rice, on your jasmine rice, you do not, in fact, stir it up. You make lines that sort of swirl through it so that when you are eating the rice, you actually have bites that are almost pure white rice. You have bites that are a little bit stained with the soy sauce, and then you have actually like full-on bites of like soaked rice in soy sauce. And, you know, it took me 10 years to apply this principle to my real life. But I actually have taken the soy sauce principle and now think about it in my real life, which is to say that if you make everything the same, you know, you raise the sodium and the salt and you spread it all around, it doesn't matter, your palate adjusts to that level of salt and then it all tastes the same. But what actually is good is to have some variety to the things that you are doing, to the actions that you take in a board game. As you can see, this relates one-to-one with board gaming, right?
If everything has soy sauce, nothing has soy sauce.
That's exactly right. So how that applies here, I think Tekhenu is a good example for me of a game that does not live up to the soy sauce principle, which is to say that each turn does not feel like there is a build or a crescendo. It feels largely like it is a point grab, a tactical point grab on every action. There are some actions where you can do a little bit more, or you're getting closer to bigger cards. I'm not saying that every turn in Tekhenu is exactly the same, but the flavor of the decision-making process, what you are doing, does not substantially change, and all 16 actions of that game are, you know, how many points can I squeak out, can I eke out right now, does not, to me, feel like it is spreading out decision making. So if I switch this over real quick to a game that I think has a great sense of pacing, Fast Sloths by Friedman Freeze. At the beginning of the game, everyone is starting in a different location and the infrastructure is not built, but your cards, you have a lot of cards and a lot of options. And as you go, you are moving around the map. Everyone is barreling towards the end of the game, but the game trades your hand limit for the infrastructure that is on the board, so that at the end of the game, what you have in your hand is a crippled economy, but a explored infrastructure on the board that you have to try to exploit. So the beginning of the game is create infrastructure through an overabundance of cards, and you barrel towards a conclusion where it's still tight. That arc of the beginning to the end is very tight and concise, but what it feels like at the beginning feels like blazing a trail in the Amazon. I don't think they're in the Amazon. I'm not exactly sure where the sloths... Are they in the Amazon, Neil?
Yeah, South America seems right for sloths.
Perfect. At the end of the game, it feels substantively different to me. So for me, the Fast Sloths is an example of a game that I feel like follows this arc.
Another way that games can have a nice pace for me is when it quickens the pace of my heartbeat. I like games where, as the game progresses, the impact for your decisions get more and more powerful or impactful, to reuse the word. An example of this, I just like games that get more and more tense, more and more nerve-wracking as the game goes along. My number one example of this is The Estates. A problem with this game, and a problem with a lot of games like this, is the Splendor problem of, you know, you can be out early if you make a mistake. I think happened to Nealon and Bus, happens to a lot of people with Splendor games, and it can happen with people in the States. You can be sort of out of the game fairly early in the States, and that's a bad aspect of it. Bad because I think it lessens the interest level for people who are not gamers. I think when I see a game that you can be out early on, my concern is like, well, are people going to play this and not like it because they could be out early on? But I don't mind it personally so much, but I can see that negative aspect. But with a game like Estates, with a lot of other Splendor games, as you get closer to the end, things sort of tighten up and things are generally opaque early on. You know, Estates, you've got all these blocks and you've got all these spots to put them in, and you're not really sure which row is going to score, which row is going to double. There's a lot of like lack of clarity as to what's going on early on. But once you get closer and closer to the end, things have been clear. You know where the points are probably going to come from, or you think you know where the points are going to come from. And now every action is huge. You know, like every dollar that swishes around the economy in the Estates is big. And I love that like pace quickening. Please don't let Nealon bid on this block because I really, really need it, that sort of thing. So when decisions for games get more and more weighty as the game progresses, that's another aspect of pace that I really, really enjoy.
One of the games I actually had on my list, which I think you've basically covered beautifully just in that description, is Taj Mahal, because that gets to a point where you're like, I can see you're building up to that lot that you know is perfect for you, and then everything rides on that, and that moment comes, and it feels like such a rush when it's there.
Right.
But yeah, that beautifully articulates what I love about Taj Mahal in this case. I think like area control games like Troops on the Map games, Kemet, for instance, is a very good example of this, of building up moments of tension. Like you have this deliberate sort of pace setting, then someone takes a temple, and that's going to get them a bunch of victory points, and it's this big moment, and then suddenly everyone's attention now has to be brought to that moment. The big fight breaks out and the tension releases a little bit. Then you go back to play setting, you build up. As it gets towards the end of the game, those moments get bigger and bigger because suddenly it's not just a couple of points, it's the game-winning point, right? Rising Sun, I think, also does this beautifully, specifically by having its sort of bi-phase approach. You have the layout phase and then you have the combat phase. So everything about acquiring all of the actions and moving your troops around the board, all of that just feels like the setup, and you're watching the pieces move into place, and you're thinking like, am I going to get the chance to do this last move before this erupts into combat where everyone's involved and the board like resets and drastic changes happen?
So an element of pace for me that I imagine you guys might disagree with, that I think Bus lacks, is I love it when there is a sense of play at the beginning of the game that ratchets up towards those action moments. I think that Bus is so cutthroat and so tight that from the very beginning, like other Splendor games, there's no sense of play. And I would actually extend that to Food Chain Magnate, where the promise of Food Chain Magnate is in that moment of play. It's like, I'm going to run my business like this. I'm going to get a waitress who's going to hire an executive chef, and that's going to be fun and interesting, is unfortunately marred by the fact that you might actually already be out of the game because you had a little bit of play at the beginning. Now, what I say when I say play, I think about a game like Archipelago, where what everyone is trying to do is obfuscated at the beginning of the game. And so there's a little bit of like, I'm going to go exploring, I'm going to build a hut. And I like those moments that aren't just I like cutthroat games, and I like games that start and end cutthroat, but Archipelago has this sense of, at the beginning, we're going exploring, and then suddenly paranoia has set in, and then suddenly the stock market has flooded, and so it has different notes to how you are interacting with the game systems, and then crescendos or blows up or explodes at the end of the game as you're looking at each other and wondering how this thing is going to end.
Yeah.
That is something that I enjoy from a pacing perspective, and something that I feel like is hard to achieve. I almost don't know how to balance. I want to let everyone have fun and explore the system, but I also want to make the best player win at the end of the game, and I want this to be a highly strategic game. You know, I think that Risk games also do a pretty good job of like everyone sort of is out there feeling out their borders, or even diplomacy. There's a little bit of an exhale before the knives come out. And I particularly enjoy that. When I realize that a game is a race game, I sometimes go, oh man, this is a race game.
Right. You got to hit the ground running sort of thing.
Great. So the question that we wanted to answer is games that we feel like, well, I have it written down, common pacing problems and where to find them. But this just comes from my love of Harry Potter and all things in the wizarding world.
I think games that have problems with pacing, a lot of times they don't have an engine that you're building. Sort of like Tekhenu, what Kellen was saying earlier. Like, it's a game that sort of looks like it's going to be a combo-y. I'm going to get stronger here, which is going to make me stronger here. And there is that to some extent, but there is a lot of just grab points. A game that sort of sprung to mind for me where I thought it'd be more combo-y, but it ended up being just like sort of a steady level was Escape Plan, the Lacerda game Escape Plan. It didn't ever feel like you were ramping up. It just felt like the same the entire time. You didn't feel like you were getting stronger. There was a tension at the end where you wanted to escape first, but that was really the only tension point. And it just felt a little too much that the rice had been stirred in with the soy sauce. It all
the
felt,
aforementioned soy sauce principle.
That's right. Exactly. I felt a little too uniform. That game felt a little too uniform the entire way for me. So, Escape.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty common problem with Euro games, as like exemplified by what we were saying about with Tekhenu. But I also just want to emphasize that it's not necessarily a given. I think that there are Euro games that subvert this in some very, very excellent ways. Yeah. I alluded to the idea that how Trois and Tekhenu differ, and I think Trois is a good example of a Euro game that by creating like this player-driven tightness fight over the dice, and the dwindling pool creates these very strong moments of tension that build up over the course of a round. And it's like something that's like, I think also very strongly represented in the difference between, like, say, Uwe Rosenberg's games and Rainer Knizia. Like, Rainer Knizia sort of always has this feistiness to his Euro designs. There's a little bit of spiciness and intrigue and the sense that there are going to be these rise and falls and highs and lows throughout the game rather than the staid pace of your average Uwe game. I think what's interesting is that we had alluded to engine builders in particular as a good example of this, and deck builders in particular as basically a type of engine builder. But actually, I kind of had this listed as almost not necessarily a negative, but the thing I sometimes find with playing a lot of deck builders is that first third of the game always kind of feels the same in a way that I think it's a necessary part of the overall arc of the game, but it feels like the worst paced part of any game, where you're very powerless and you can't do much and you're just waiting for it to start to get interesting. I don't know how you solve that because it's kind of like part and parcel of deck builders, but I always feel like at the beginning of every deck builder, I'm like, oh yeah, this part of the game.
Well, wait, but the last third of a deck builder, you're just running the deck that you've built. So which third of a deck builder is the good part?
The middle third.
Maybe there isn't. Maybe this is the dark secret of engine builder games. There's never actually a good part, because then you get to the end of it and you run and the game's over. It's all anticipation and no payoff.
I think Fort does a good job of subverting this, because with Fort and Spakoof, there's no real ramping up. You have just decisions the entire time of, can I hold on to these cards? Which cards do I need to play to make sure I keep them and avoid having them out in the system for other players to pick off?
Cool.
How it ends matters a whole lot to how pacing feels. There are a lot of Euro games that the last two rounds is almost like cleanup. You know, you've achieved what you could achieve, and then you clean up. Or it's like, okay, I guess I can earn 3 or 2 or 4 points in this last turn.
Yeah.
And those sort of sputter out and have a bad sense of pacing for me. And Neelan, it's funny you mentioned Trois, because Trois has a thing where the first 3 rounds of the game, new combo cards are unveiled. And then the last 2 rounds, it's run your engine. And I find a weird disconnect in the pacing. I understand why it exists in Trois, because that gives everyone an opportunity to get the die that they need to run those engines. But I sometimes feel like it's badly paced near the end of Trois. And Trois is a game that I just adore. Another game that has great pacing, Splendor, I think, and we've talked about this in other episodes, it ends before you want it to. It's that first half of the game takes 3/4 of the game, and then it's over before you realize it and you want to restart. I find that a common sentiment in games that has good pacing for me. One bad or negative type of pacing problem is exemplified in some of my favorite games. I went right to my favorite games. Let's kill our darlings. Not Christina, my number one darling. Are Dogs of War and Cursed Court. Both use a round system that resets. So the problem with this is that what you do in each round is largely the same. And it builds better in Dogs of War because you're sort of aligning with these secret factions. And Cursed Court, it just doesn't at all. You know, it's like Neelan gets ahead in the first round of Cursed Court, and then we reset. And it feels a little like playing a hand of cards and then being like, should we play this Oink game another round, or is one round of Deep Sea Adventure enough? And so I find that a poor substitute for actual pacing, and I would prefer a game that didn't use that traditional round-based structure to either pad the length of the game or build out the amount of luck. I would prefer it to be one round. Even though Dogs of War is a great game, even though Cursed Court and Dogs of War are in my top 50 games of all time, I don't think they nail the pacing that a proper arc of a game with sort of breakout moments has. Even though within those rounds they have those moments, because that's why they're on the list. It's sort of like Time's Up, which is an amazing job of pace, an amazing sense of the first round takes 80% of the game length, and then you are barreling towards the end, and the laughter is compounded, and the laughter is sort of all packed into the end, because the jokes come back. So you make the jokes over a length of time, and then there's the climax of the movie there at the end as the jokes are flying and the game is ending, and it's bam, 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 and it's over before you are upset, and then you want to start over and play Time's Up again.
That is such a good example, because it's almost like in a way that we've spoken about times up in the past about this idea that the early goings are laying the groundwork for like the highs later. It's almost exactly everything we're talking about. It's like this slow ramp up that is still very, very fun, and then the payoff at the end is perfect and quick. It doesn't drag on longer than it needs to. Yeah, that's an excellent example.
I'd be remiss. I think I just have to mention, because whenever I think of games with good pace, the number one example for me is Marco Polo. Oh, you thought I was going to go to
Lord.
Yeah. I mean, if we want to talk about that, I'm happy to talk, because I agree with that. Biblios has great pace too, but I think Marco Polo is for me the number one example of a game that has a great pace because it ends before you want it to. Like one round before you think you fully achieved everything you want, it ends, and it always leaves me wanting more.
That is going to do it. We are going to end this episode right on time. I will say we have always had a good sense of pacing.
Absolutely.
We have an hour-long podcast. We have other friends in the board game community who have no sense of pacing.
Terrible.
We release 2-hour-plus episodes. We're
Why?
looking at you,
My question is
Mr.
why?
Dan Hughes and Mr. Mike Delicious. They just rattle on, long after we've gotten tired of them. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. You can find us on all forms of social media. You can argue with us on Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. You can talk to us in a slower format at boardgamebarrage.com/guild. Be on the lookout. We have merch coming in hot. Hopefully soon. Once I figure out the sales tax situation and how to charge you all sales tax. We are very excited to get that up and running. The people have demanded, and so we shall give it to them.
Give the people what they want.
This is Kellen, your founder and host, signing off. So long. Oh, wait. Thank you to Art Society for allowing us to use the fantastic song What's on Your Mind, Kid from their album Wake the Queens. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for spreading the word of the podcast. It helps us tremendously. We are very happy to have been able to put on this podcast even in these hard times. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, Mark.
Yes.
Okay. You're gonna have to tighten that up. There's good stuff there, but it's too long. It's too long.
Look,
Okay.
I'm used to tightening all up.
So, just cut out some of the Mark parts and then some of the Nealon parts,
Right.
and then it'll be sort of a good arc, beginning, middle, end to it. You know what I mean?
Try. See how it goes.
Well, we don't have to try. I mean, all the pieces are there for you.
That's true.
If you can't get
You've given me all the building blocks, and let's just lift.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You're the maestro.
I'm
now.
the child with the Legos that you've given me.
Yeah, and if
build
you
that
can't
out.
do it, we could hire someone on Fiverr for
We can hire a
$5.
chimp.
Yeah, with this gold, the chimp
That's right, yeah,
could get us to the finish line.